All right, let's dive in. And today we're looking into the case of Anthony Kirkland. You sent over a whole bunch of articles, legal documents, the whole shebang, which tells me you want to go deeper than just like the surface level of what he did.
Yeah, it seems like you're really interested in the why, the how, the whole complicated story behind his crimes. And trust me, this case, it's definitely got those twists and turns that make it stand out.
Yeah, it's not your run-of-the-mill true crime story, that's for sure.
Not at all. We're talking decades here, right? We start with a murder back in '87, then prison time, parole, and then boom, another string of brutal killings between 2006 and 2009. And that's what ultimately landed him on death row.
And that's what gets me right. He was granted parole after that first murder, even though it was, well, horrific. And then there's this whole change in Ohio law that seems to have played a part. So before we get into the later stuff, can you take us back? What about his early life and that first murder in '87?
Well, his defense team, they point to a difficult childhood, right? But like a lot of these cases, saying that's the sole reason is probably too simple. What we know for sure is that in '87, Kirkland was just 18 when he raped and murdered his girlfriend, Leola Douglas.
It's tough to even process that level of violence at 18, and then he tried to cover up the rape by setting her body on fire. I mean, that just adds a whole other level of, I don't know, premeditation to it all.
It does. It really points to, well, a lack of remorse, even at that age. He did eventually plead guilty, but to voluntary manslaughter, so he got 10 to 25 years.
Okay, so prison time. Did he, show any signs of rehabilitation? What was his behavior like?
It's kind of a mixed bag, honestly. You look at his prison records, and on one hand, he's trying to improve himself. He got his GED, even an associate degree. That shows some desire for something, better.
Like there's this internal battle going on,
Right.
right? Part of him wants to change, but then there's this other part that's, well, clearly still drawn to violence.
Exactly. And we see that in his disciplinary record. Lots of infractions, solitary confinement for fighting, breaking rules. So despite the education, there are these serious questions about, well, was it genuine rehabilitation?
Right, it seems contradictory. So how does someone with that record get parole after just 16 years when the max was 25?
Here's where that change in Ohio law comes in. Basically, the Ohio Supreme Court, they made this ruling that changed how parole boards looked at inmates. They had to base their decisions only on the specific conviction, not like the full picture of the crime.
So even though he committed this horrible act, the board had to see him as, what, just a manslaughter convict? That seems like it could have some unintended consequences.
It did. The law was meant to be fair, focus on the legal charge, but in cases like Kirkland's, it creates this gap between how bad the crime actually was and the chance of getting out early. His parole really shows the limits of just focusing on the legal stuff when it comes to, rehabilitation and risk.
It's a tough realization that even when the law tries to be fair, it can't always keep up with the messiness of human behavior. Makes you think about how we figure out who's actually safe to let back into society. What do you think about this law? Did lawmakers think about these kinds of outcomes?
They're complicated, right? There were probably lots of things they considered. But cases like Kirkland's definitely make you think maybe the law needs some tweaking. The goal is to give second chances, but also keep the public safe. But hold on, because Kirkland's story, it doesn't end with parole. What happens next, it's even more disturbing. It really makes you think about the justice system and if it can actually stop people from causing more harm.
All right, let's get into that. We know that just 2 years after his release, Kirkland starts down a path that, well, ultimately sealed his fate.
Sadly, it did. His release, it was 2004, and over the next 2 years, he murdered 4 more people.
4 more? Oh, man.
Yeah, Casonia Crawford, just 14 years old, Mary Jo Newton, she was 45, Kimya Rollison, 25, and then Esme Kenny, another young girl, only 13.
It's just awful. And to think he targeted both young girls and women, that just makes understanding his motives even harder. Were there, like, patterns in these later crimes? Similarities?
There were, and they're chilling. All 4 victims were women, 3 were strangled,
Hmm.
and he burned all their bodies, probably to hide, evidence of sexual assault.
So, like, he was getting, I don't know, more methodical, each crime, more brutal, more calculated. And to think they caught him near his last victim. He still had her watch and iPod on him. The evidence must have been overwhelming.
Oh, it was. But before it even went to trial, Kirkland, he did something unexpected.
Yeah.
He pleaded guilty to 2 of the murders, Mary Jo Newton and Kimya Rollison's.
Wow. But he was still tried for the others, right? Casonia and Esme's murders? Was that like a legal strategy?
It's hard to know for sure. Maybe it was to, try and make him seem remorseful, sway the jury on the other charges. Or maybe it was real, a genuine admission of guilt for those 2. But either way, yeah, he was tried for the other two.
What happened?
Guilty. 2010, all counts, including the death penalty specifications. 2 death sentences plus 70 years to life for the others. At that point, it felt like that's it, right? But Kirkland's case, it's never simple.
This is where the legal battles really get going, don't they?
Yeah.
His lawyers weren't going to let those death sentences stand without a fight. What were their arguments in the appeals?
They weren't trying to say he was innocent. The evidence was too strong. Instead, they went after the sentencing. They argued that, like his childhood, potential mental health issues, things like that, they weren't really considered during the trial. Basically, trying to humanize him, not excuse what he did, but maybe, get the courts to think about something other than death.
It's a tough line to walk, right? Bringing up someone's past without making it seem like you're downplaying their crimes. So how'd that go, the appeals?
Long process, lots of back and forth. So 2014, the Ohio Supreme Court, they upheld the conviction, but they gave him a stay of execution.
So a pause, but not a full overturn. Any reason given for the stay?
They didn't say explicitly, but it's likely they saw something in the defense's arguments about the sentencing. Maybe they thought some things weren't looked at closely enough in the first trial. But that stay, it gave Kirkland's lawyers more time to build their case and go to higher courts.
I can only imagine how hard this must have been for the victims' families, reliving everything as Kirkland kept fighting.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that while he's fighting for his life, the families are dealing with their grief, trying to find justice, some closure, and the appeals, even though they're important for a fair system, they can really drag out the pain for the people who are hurt the most.
It's a reminder that justice, it's not always clean or quick. There's so much going on, so much pain that just doesn't fit neatly into a courtroom. So what happened next with the appeals?
Well, they went for the big one, the U.S. Supreme Court. Huge gamble, because they only take like a tiny percentage of cases.
Like a Hail Mary hoping for a miracle.
And yeah, no miracle. 2015, they declined to hear it. Looked like he was running out of options. But then, get this, the Ohio Supreme Court, they granted him a new sentencing hearing. This was in 2016.
Hold on, what? Why? Was there new evidence?
It's not totally clear from what you sent, but seems like maybe they looked at everything again and decided the first sentencing, it wasn't done right. Maybe those mitigating factors, they weren't really given enough weight. So this new hearing, it was a chance for Kirkland's lawyers to make a better case against the death penalty.
But also a chance for the families to, wow, go through it all again. Tough situation all around.
Yeah, these cases, they're never just about legal stuff. It's real people, real lives shattered.
Okay.
And the effects, they go way beyond just those directly involved.
So new hearing, turning point.
Not really. 2017, right before the hearing, Kirkland's attorneys, Perry Ancona and Norm Aubin, they asked to be taken off the case.
Wait, seriously? Why?
Conflict of interest. Another lawyer from, like, the state public defender's office, he wasn't officially on the team, but he was talking to Kirkland about the case, could have messed with the defense strategy.
So this other lawyer might have actually hurt their case.
Yeah, that was the worry. So Ancona and Aubin, they stepped down, made an already messy situation even messier.
Wow. But the new hearing, it still happened, right? In 2018. Did they manage to convince the jury?
No, they didn't. Even with the mitigating factors, the whole argument against the death penalty, the jury, they still recommended death.
So after everything, back to square one.
Basically. August 2018, a judge, he reinstated the death sentence, back on death row.
And that's where he is now, right?
Yep. Chillicothe Correctional Institution, Ohio. His case, it's become this symbol, of the whole debate about the death penalty, how complicated the justice system is, makes you think about punishment, rehabilitation, what justice even means.
It's definitely a case that sticks with you. What are your thoughts? Is there a point where, even with the worst crimes, something other than death is the answer?
That's a huge question, no easy answers.
Yay.
But it's something we all got to think about. Cases like this, they make us look at what we believe about second chances, about punishment, what the purpose of all this is. Do we think people can change, even after doing terrible things? Or is the death penalty the only way for certain crimes? No easy answers, but definitely worth thinking about.
It's true. It's not just about Kirkland. It's about us and how we deal with violence, with harm, with how messed up human behavior can be. But before we wrap up, we got to go back to something you mentioned, Kirkland's parole and that Ohio law. You said that's key to the whole story. Why?
Yeah, it feels like that parole decision, it hangs over everything else we've talked about. Like it's connected to those later murders, you know what I mean? It makes you wonder, could those murders have been stopped? It's a tough question, for sure. And it really gets at the heart of how we do parole, how we assess risk. Remember, at first, Kirkland was denied parole. because of how bad that first crime was, the rape and murder of Leola Douglas. But then that change in Ohio law happened, the one where they had to focus on the conviction, not the whole picture of the crime. That's what opened the door for him to get out.
So it's like this legal detail, it kind of overshadowed the fact that he was dangerous?
Yeah, and it shows where the system can break down. The law, they wanted to be fair, just look at the charge. But with Kirkland, it created this gap between what he actually did and whether he was a risk to do it again.
So even though he did that terrible thing, the board had to treat him like he was just a manslaughter guy, not a rapist and murderer. Do you think that law changed? Did it lead to those other murders?
We can't know for sure, but it's a scary thought. If the board could have looked at the whole thing, the brutality, how he tried to cover it up, maybe they would have kept him in.
It shows that just going by the legal stuff, it's not enough to predict what someone's going to do. Laws are meant to be fair, but they can't always deal with how complicated people are.
Exactly. It's so complex.
Yeah.
We have risk assessments, parole guidelines, all that, but they're not perfect. There's no way to know for sure who's going to reoffend.
So Kirkland, he's a warning, right? About how hard it is to balance giving people second chances with keeping everyone safe. How do we even figure out who's really changed and who's still a danger?
That's the big question, what everyone's trying to figure out. And we have to admit, sometimes, even when we do our best, we make mistakes.
And those mistakes, they can be devastating, not just for the victims and their families, but for the whole community.
You're right. Kirkland's story, it's a tragedy. It reminds us of the cost of violence, how it ripples outward, how it affects so many people. It makes us face the fact that the justice system has limits, that it's a struggle to try and help people change while also protecting everyone else.
This deep dive, it's been eye-opening, but man, it's heavy stuff. We've gone through so much. Kirkland's life, his first crime, getting out, the other murders, the trials, the appeals, where he is now, the whole death penalty debate. But I feel like there's still so much to think about.
And that's how it is with these cases, right?
Yeah.
They stay with you. They make you question things. They challenge your ideas about justice, about second chances, about people in general.
It's been a journey, and I'm grateful for your insights. Any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to really make them think about this case and what it all means?
Here's a question to ponder. Knowing everything we know now about Anthony Kirkland, if we could go back, what could we have done differently? Could we have stopped those other murders from happening? Does his story show us something broken in our justice system? Or is it just, well, a sad case where we couldn't predict what he would do, where the signs were missed, where the system just failed? I don't have those answers, but those are the questions we have to keep asking, the ones we need to wrestle with if we want to understand these complicated issues.
That's a powerful question, and it goes beyond just Kirkland. His story, it's like a small version of these bigger problems we face as a society. How do we deal with violent crime? How do we help people change? How do we make justice work? And that's what the deep dive is all about. Taking a close look at tough issues, seeing different sides, making people think critically, having real discussions. Thanks for coming along with us. We hope you have a better grasp on this case now and what it means for all of us. Keep those minds working, folks. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.